Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon
and Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
Hello there, it's 6 o'clock. I'm Michelle Dewberry, and this is Dewbs & Co, the show where we'll get into the things that have got you talking tonight. And I'll tell you what's got me talking tonight for sure. Rotherham, Rochdale, Telford, Oxford, Burnley, Dewsbury, Peterborough, Halifax, Leicester, Bristol, Derby and Newcastle upon Tyne. That is just to name a few places where we know that grooming gangs operated and sexually exploited and horrifically abused thousands of children, much of it ignored and dismissed for years, often for fear of being called racist. And now today, a damning report has been released and found that far from being on the wane, this child abuse is still happening, as is the ridiculous and shameful response to it. What on earth is it going to take for this issue to be taken seriously and rooted out once and for all? And Boris Johnson, he's just doing a press conference and he's been threatening a package of sanctions as soon as the first Russian Turkat crosses into Ukraine. What do you think to that? Will it make a difference to Putin's plans? And Labour MP Rosie Duffield is said to be considering her future in the Labour Party following what she calls obsessive harassment from current and former party members. Her crime? Daring to speak out in defence of women's sex-based rights. And the wolf whistle and catcalling, flattering or borderline harassment. Undercover police will be taken to the streets to tackle this. Good idea or a little bit of overkill? All that to come, but first, the latest news headlines.
Thank you, Michelle. Good evening. I'm Miranda Shunker in the GB newsroom. The Prime Minister says Russia's 100,000 troops on Ukraine's border is the biggest demonstration of hostility in our lifetime. Speaking during the last half hour in Kiev with the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, Boris Johnson added that Moscow can still step back. A call with Russia's President Vladimir Putin has been rescheduled for tomorrow afternoon. The Prime Minister urged the Kremlin to choose the path of diplomacy.
It goes without saying that a further Russian invasion of Ukraine would be a political disaster, a humanitarian disaster. In my view, it would also be, for Russia, for the world, a military disaster as well.
The Manchester United footballer Mason Greenwood has been further arrested on suspicion of sexual assault and threats to kill. The 20-year-old Premier League player was first arrested on Sunday on suspicion of rape and assault of a young woman. It follows social media images and videos being posted online. Detectives have been granted more time to question him. The public will be told if Boris Johnson is fined for breaching lockdown rules, Downing Street has confirmed. It follows Number 10 previously implying the information might not be disclosed, saying it was a matter for the Met Police. The Prime Minister has apologised after the Sue Gray report found failures of leadership and judgment. He says he would publish everything that we can once the inquiries have been finalised. Conservative MP Andrew Bridgen told GB News the buck stops with the Prime Minister.
We've got a concession from the Prime Minister that he will release the Sue Gray report unredacted in full. All we've seen is 12 pages of filleted report, but that was actually damning enough. Serious misjudgments and leadership across Number 10 and the Cabinet Office, widening the blame, never mentioning the Prime Minister, but ultimately he sets the culture in Number 10 and the government.
Well, meanwhile, Downing Street says the Prime Minister stands by his comments in the Commons yesterday about Sir Keir Starmer's record as a prosecutor. The Labour leader says claims he failed to prosecute the
Director
notorious...
of Public Prosecutions, Mr Speaker, he spent most of his time prosecuting journalists and failing to prosecute Jimmy Savile, as far as I can make out.
The Labour leader says claims he failed to prosecute the notorious sex offender are false. Sir Keir was Director of Public Prosecutions at the time, but he was not directly involved in the case. The House of Commons Speaker says he's far from satisfied that the Prime Minister's comments were appropriate. Scotland's First Minister says current COVID restrictions will remain in place for at least another 3 weeks. Speaking to MSPs earlier, Nicola Sturgeon says despite cases of the virus remaining high, recent data gives ground for optimism. The current restrictions include face masks in schools, hybrid working from home, and face coverings when using public transport and indoor public spaces. A man who killed his ex-girlfriend and her autistic son before going on the run has been convicted of their murders. Daniel Bolton walked from Skegness to Louth in Lincolnshire to kill Bethany Vincent and her 9-year-old son Darren Henson in May last year. He then led police on a 24-hour manhunt. Jurors dismissed the 30-year-old's claim of being on autopilot at the time of the murders. He'll be sentenced at Lincoln Crown Court tomorrow. A driver who used his car to stop a knifeman as he stabbed a woman in London has been released without charge. Met Police say the motorist, who's known as Abraham, has been released after officers reviewed the law around self-defence and defence of another. They say they consider the 26-year-old a vital witness rather than a suspect. More than 1 in 10 children are starting school in England without having had their measles, mumps and rubella jab. Take-up of the vaccine is at its lowest rate in a decade. The World Health Organization says 95% of children need to be vaccinated to keep measles at bay, but the current coverage for 2 doses of the MMR jab is around 85%. Dr. Sarah Kayat says even a small drop in vaccine take-up can cause problems.
We know that even small insults in that level can result in outbreaks on a population level. And I think with COVID restrictions coming down, travel becoming more popular again, we have to remember that there may be travel from more endemic areas where you know, measles is more endemic, and that will mean outbreaks will start happening.
Well, on TV, online and DAB+ radio, this is GB News. Now it's back to Dewbs & Co.
Thanks for that. Well, keeping me company until 7 o'clock tonight. My panel, Rick Moore, who's the Deputy Chair of the Blackburn Conservative Association, filmmaker Kerry Dingle, and James Bloodworth, who's a journalist and author. And you know the drill by now. It's not just about us and our thoughts, it's about you at home and yours as well. You can get in touch with me. Tell me, what is on your mind tonight? What do you think about the topics that we're discussing? Your thoughts on them, you can get in touch with me. Email gbviews@gbnews.uk. Or you can tweet me at Michelle Dewbs or at GB News. But first, our top story. Boris Johnson says strict sanctions against Russia are ready to go as soon as a tow cap crosses into Ukraine. With rising tensions between Russia and Ukraine, the Prime Minister is in Kiev talking with the Ukrainian president. Around 100,000 Russian troops are on the border with Ukraine with fears of a possible invasion. Boris is trying to defuse the tensions. Both the US and the UK have threatened severe sanctions on Russia if it invades. Let's have a little listen to what Boris was saying just a few minutes ago.
It goes without saying that a further Russian invasion of Ukraine would be a political disaster, a humanitarian disaster. In my view, it would also be, for Russia, for the world, a military disaster as well. Alongside other countries, we are also preparing a package of sanctions and other measures to be enacted the moment the first Russian tow cap crosses further into Ukrainian territory. And we have done all this and prepared all this, not as a show of hostility towards Russia, but as a demonstration that we will always stand up for freedom and democracy and Ukrainian sovereignty in the face of aggression.
Well, joining me with the latest on this is our Home and Security Editor, Mark White. Mark, good evening to you. I was just playing the Boris Johnson clip just a moment there. He's in Ukraine, talking away. Your thoughts on all of this?
Well, clearly this is a display by the British Prime Minister of support, wholehearted support for the Ukrainian people at this very difficult time for them. For a couple of months now, we've had this troop build-up on the Ukrainian-Russian border, now believed to number about 110,000 troops, tanks and other armoured vehicles on that border, right along that border, now up into Belarus as well. In the Belarusian-Ukrainian border region, there are some 30,000 Russian troops. Now, Russia says that it has no intention of crossing the border into Ukraine proper. This is about detailed and sustained military exercises in that region. But really what it's about, of course, is upping the ante. It's coercive in terms of trying to get the West round the table. And Vladimir Putin, of course, wants concessions. And the biggest concession that he wants, that he's not going to get, according to the US and the UK, is to stop Ukraine becoming a member of NATO. Now, Ukraine has said in the past that at some point it would like to join the military alliance. Russia's concern is that since the Cold War, some 14 Eastern European countries have joined NATO. They see that as an existential threat to Russia itself, and they do not want Ukraine to follow suit. So they are trying to get concessions on that. They're trying to get the West and NATO to back off and put some kind of guarantee down there. They said that at the end of the Cold War, there was a verbal guarantee that there would not be eastward expansion of NATO. And they say that in the years since, there has indeed been exactly that. They want it to stop now, but I can't see that happening.
Thanks, Mark. Before I do let you go, though, Mark, I've got something that caught my eye, I have to say. The press conference that was just happening just then that Boris was giving, just played a clip of it as well. You might have noticed, I certainly did, that one of the first, I think it was, in fact, the first question to Boris Johnson was, I think it was from the BBC, about Partygate. I found it absolutely awful. Just give a bit of insight, if you will, to my viewers. But this is a very serious topic, what's happening in Ukraine. You've just been explaining it very well there. How do these press conferences work? Do the journalists have to submit their questions in advance? Would that have been completely spontaneous? Just give us a bit of an insight, if you will, on how that works.
Well, it's one of these pesky things, Michelle, about a democracy where they are not requiring journalists like us to submit the questions in advance. But that means, yes, that news organisations with an agenda of their own may well ask questions like Partygate. Certainly our viewers and listeners have been pretty vociferous in recent weeks that they are thoroughly fed up of all of the fallout from Partygate, and they want to move on to talk about real issues of concern, issues like what is happening on the Ukrainian-Russian border, because although Russia says it's no intention of invading, there's a massive build-up of troops now on both sides of that border. And the trouble with brinkmanship is that it only takes a misstep for that to end in bloodshed. And of course, then there are potential widespread ramifications. As Boris Johnson said there in Kiev, and he's quite right, that any conflict that was to erupt there of a sizable proportion would potentially spill over into other Eastern European countries, NATO members, which would then directly involve countries like the United Kingdom. So it is of great importance, and one you can understand why viewers and listeners are rather anxious to get off Partygate and onto more tangible issues like this.
Indeed, Mark White, that's our Home and Security Editor. Thank you very much for your insight. And sorry, I did just have to get that off my chest because, quite frankly, I found it embarrassing that there's a press conference of something of such magnitude, and yet still Partygate is question number one. I mean, come on. Anyway, got that off my chest, feel better now. James Bloodworth, your thoughts on everything Ukraine?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you about it being very parochial to bring... Partygate's important, but in the context of Ukraine, it's a very parochial thing to bring up. I think the Ukraine issue, I think it's important that Boris Johnson and Joe Biden send a robust message so as not to embolden Vladimir Putin. However, I would also say that I'm still sceptical. I may be proven completely wrong, not for the first time, when saying that I don't think an actual invasion will take place. I think the Vladimir Putin's aim is long-term aim is to destabilize Ukraine. An invasion would involve taking Kiev, which is a city of 3 million people, that would involve significant Russian casualties, whatever happened. I think the aim is to destabilize Ukraine long-term and get the United States and the EU and NATO countries to recognize Putin's supposed claim on Eastern Europe that countries like Ukraine, but also Romania and the Baltic states should not be in NATO. I think that's his he wants to get some kind of leeway and some recognition of his position in the kind of corridors of power. I don't think he actually wants to invade, because I think these troop build-ups have been happening on and off for the past, since 2014. I mean, I hope there's no invasion, but I actually think he's looking for concessions first and foremost.
Kerry?
I think James is right. First, that Russia certainly doesn't want to invade. I think that's mythical and very much part of what Boris is doing, and Biden, in fact, which is moral grandstanding. This is for domestic consumption, in my view. It's got very little to do with Ukraine, that Boris is suddenly going over there and, being the big statesman and trying to take part in global diplomacy, when a fortnight ago, when NATO was having serious talks on this, Ben Wallace, Foreign Secretary, was in Australia. I mean, it wasn't even on the government agenda. So I don't think we should be... I think we should be very sceptical about this and what's happening, recognise this is sabre-rattling, and that Russia is not a threat to us. And those troops, it's not a recent build-up. They've been 100,000 there since last April. Right. So I really think sabre-rattling is a dangerous way to go, and we should have none of it.
Rick?
Definitely a lot of sabre-rattling going on, and there's definitely a need to lower the tensions. And I think the other thing that we've got to remember is that we're at a slight disadvantage because we haven't got security of supply of our own energy. We haven't been fracking, we haven't been building nuclear power, and we're reliant on other places, including Russia, for our gas supply. And if they do invade Ukraine, if you think gas prices are high now, wait to see what happens if that does happen.
Yeah, I mean, I think we do get a small amount from Russia, don't we? I think it's more the EU, I have to say, that get their energy, but nonetheless very important, that whole kind of energy situation. You lot are in touch, you guys at home. Lots of you picking up the same point that I did right at the start of this about the questioning at such an important point, saying basically it makes our country often look a laughingstock. Got to say, I completely agree with you there. I will take a quick break, come back in just a moment. When I do come back, I want to talk to you about grooming gangs. It seems that this is a big problem all across the UK. We'll have that and more coming up in just a few minutes.
Hello there, I'm Eamon.
And I'm Isabel.
And you're watching the GB News digital stream across the United Kingdom.
And around the world.
If you're here in the UK, you can also watch us on your TV screen. GB News is Freeview channel 236.
On Sky, we're channel 515.
626 on Virgin Media.
Just remember, you might need to retune your TV to watch the channel.
Yeah, and if you are doing that, find out more about
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, and there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilized conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon
and Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
Hello there, welcome back to Dewbs & Co with me, Michelle Dewberry. I will just remind you of who my panel is tonight, because I know that lots of you listen as opposed to watch, so you won't be able to see these glorious faces next to mine. First up, we've got Rick Moore, who's the Deputy Chair of Blackburn Conservative Association. Then we've got Kerry Dingle, who's a filmmaker, and James Bloodworth, who is an author and a journalist. Right, let's move on, shall we? I have to say, this is a story I feel very passionate about, an independent inquiry into basic grooming gangs, let's call them what they are. Here it says child sexual abuse, but come on, we know what we're talking about. It's grooming gangs in the main part. And it seems that while people might have perhaps thought that this has been waning or wanted to give the impression that this was kind of in the decline and waning, alas not, it continues to be widespread in the UK. And to a greater extent than official statistics indicate. The IICSA's findings say that assumptions that abuse has fallen since high-profile cases in Rotherham and Rochdale were flawed. And this report that came out today exposes damning failures by councils and police, leaving victims treated as though that they were basically the ones in the wrong, and perpetrators not being investigated or prosecuted. I have to say, let's share some of these findings. Perpetrators are finding new ways, including through technology, to groom and degrade ever younger children. This form of exploitation has profoundly damaging impacts on children and their families. There were several examples of child victims of sexual exploitation being charged with criminal offences and consequently incurring criminal records, despite the backgrounds to their offending being inextricably indexed with their exploitation. Now, Kerry Dingle, this is a subject that really makes me incredibly angry. The reason it makes me incredibly angry is because I don't know what it is. I don't know if it's political correctness. I don't know if it's... Well, no, I do actually. I do know what it is. It's political correctness, and it's a fear, terrified to be seen as being racist, etc. And the impact of this is on children that have been, I mean, I've read some of this stuff, and because it's tea time, I won't share all the gory details with you, but it's appalling what these people are doing to children.
I agree with you. I think it's really shocking, and I think what's striking from this recent report is that this is young... I mean, actually, they do in the report refer to it as grooming gangs, and it's more widespread than we imagine. And the shocking thing for me is that this is young, white, working-class girls being prostituted, raped and exploited, and it doesn't hit the headlines. But if it was an MP or a celebrity who had their knee touched, it would be headline news and there would be outrage. But it's young, white, working-class girls who are... not only, as the report tells us, being victims of these sort of onslaught, but are also being criminalised at the same time, often because they've got into gangs themselves. And so their sexual exploitation is entirely overlooked. I think it's an outrage, and I think you're right, because we know that there has been all these cases of Pakistani men not being prosecuted or chased or tracked down because of fears of being called as racist or Islamophobic, people get away with it. And I think that's intolerable, absolutely intolerable.
Well, joining us to discuss this more is Professor Ray Jones. Good evening to you. He is a Professor of Social Work at Kingston University. Ray, what do you think when you hear this report?
Well, it's horrific, and it's a wake-up call. It's a reminder again that we really need to keep hammering away at this. And this is not a new issue. This is not a new issue. I mean, I've been involved in social work and children's social services for 50 years now. I can remember in the 1970s, a young girl of 14 who was being passed around by her boyfriend to other men. I can remember in the 1980s, we were having to take on with the police taxi drivers in a city who were hanging around outside of our children's homes and trying to get both boys and girls to leave the homes and to go off with them. I can remember in the 1990s having to arrange secret accommodation to move home for a social worker who was giving evidence in court against a man who was prostituting a young girl in a city, and where the social worker had received very serious threats about her own safety. So that's the 1970s, 1980s and 1990s. It's become, if you like, more known as an issue in the 2010s because of Rotherham, etc. But it's been with us for a long time, and it is still with us today, and we must really hammer away at it.
Yeah, see, I'm fascinated. I mean, I asked you your thoughts on this, and the first thing you said, it was a wake-up call. And what I'm interested, your view on this, is, to me, the wake-up call was years ago when it became quite apparent that thousands of young girls were being groomed and abused right across the country. I mean, I listed just a few places at the start of this programme, but there are many more. And I know, for example, it happened in my hometown of Hull as well. So why wasn't the wake-up call then? Why didn't people wake up and stay awake and say never again?
Well, there has been some waking up, and I can think of many areas of the country where they now have dedicated teams of police officers, youth workers, social workers, engaging with schools, for example, to make sure that they're identifying young people who are being groomed, being potentially exploited and being prepared for exploitation. I can think of the activity that's going on in many areas to engage with the licensing authorities for taxi drivers, for the fast food all-night outlets, for hotels, etc., to on the job, working out where people may be, young people may be vulnerable, and trying to focus in on those locations. So there's activity underway, but the difficulty I've got, and the difficulty that came through from this report today, is that this is not consistent across the country. And yet the issue, the terrible issue of exploitation, probably is in all of our communities somewhere. And it's not just the urban communities. And in the urban communities, it may be, I don't know, awful, 15, 20, 25 men involved. But in rural areas, it might be 2 or 3 or 4 men involved. It's right across the country, and we have to be looking for it everywhere.
Yeah, I have to say, you reach a key point there. This report, it did only focus on a small number of places. One of the things that the report did indicate today was that it called out the failure to collect data on the ethnicity of the perpetrators. Why, firstly, why do you think that's happening? And secondly, why, in your view, is that information important?
Well, it's something that ought to be collected. I do not know why it is not being collected. It's not within the required databases that the government asks people to collect information about. Why is it important? Because we need to know what's going on in every community, including communities which may be primarily ethnic minority communities with different cultural and ethnic groups within them, people with different cultural heritage. We have to know what's going on in every community, and we have to call it out within every community. So I have no problem in collecting the data. I have no problem in naming it. We have to be upfront in terms of doing this.
Thank you very much. That's Professor Ray Jones there, who's the Professor in Social Care at Kingston University. James Bloodworth, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, the failure to collect the data, I think, is really striking because, I mean, the ethnicity of the perpetrators is important because you kind of find out it's the cultural factors which shape these people's attitudes towards women, which has the big impact on their view of young English working class girls. And one of the tragic things about the victims in this is they're often young girls who've come from the care system already, people who've come from violent, abusive homes, who've had a terrible start in life, who then go into the care system and then further exploited by these men. And it seems like there's not enough being done in terms of prevention and early intervention to protect these young girls from these abusers. And yeah, as I said originally, I do think it's very important to understand also the cultural factors which are leading to groups of men viewing young women as fair game, basically.
Yeah, and I think the problem is, in absence of this factual information, people have eyes, and people can actually see the people that are doing this. They can read names. People make, their own assumptions. And when the data is missing, I'm just looking through some of the criticisms that came out here. You have the under-reporting of this. You have the failure to collect data on the ethnicity of the perpetrators and also on the victims. I think both of that are key, because you need to understand the picture, the story, because without that, if you don't understand it, how on earth are you ever going to resolve it? Rick?
We simply cannot keep failing to keep these girls safe. It's just completely unacceptable that this is going on over and over again. It's failures by the local authorities, by the police, by social services. There just can't be any excuses anymore. And I wonder if the press had used the same zeal against grooming gangs as they've used against Boris Johnson over the last 2 weeks, would we maybe be seeing the grooming gang issue being dealt with far better?
Well, I think the answer to that is absolutely yes. And this report says as well that they wonder if there was a fear of almost some of these councils, police forces, etc., not wanting to be seen as the kind of the next Rochdale and things like that. And it's just, there should be no point in society where your worry about offending supersedes your desire to keep children safe. And I think when you get to that point, and I've got to say, I'll go out on a limb and say I think we're past that point quite some time ago, but when you're in that sphere where you literally will prioritise not offending over protecting children, I think that something has gone appallingly wrong. And I think that there needs to be accountability. Kerry, any final words from you on this topic?
Yeah, it probably relates to a later topic and your wolf whistling, but what are the police doing? Undercover work to stop drivers wolf whistling.
Don't ruin my last topic.
No, but instead of dealing with perpetrators of grooming, we have real problem here that isn't being dealt with, but the police are, this new woke police institution is being tasked with doing the most ludicrous stuff.
Yeah, lots of you are getting in touch saying this is the kind of stuff, to your point, Rick, this is the kind of stuff that the media should be focused on. Mark has got in touch saying he's an ex-nurse and therapist, now retired. He says, back in 1984, I was treating girls who were victims of sexual exploitation and grooming. He says no one, including my bosses, were interested. And I think that's a sense we've heard often, haven't we? I know the wonderful Maggie Oliver, who's someone that I have immense respect for. There's been lots of criticisms that this all just isn't taken seriously enough. And this report today shows, and by the way, this, as I said, it only focuses on a small section of places, but it shows that this is still going on and it's unacceptable. Anyway, I have to say that at GBNews, we will be following this story. We won't be turning a blind eye to it, that is for sure. Anyway, what am I doing? Am I going to a break or am I going to talk? Oh, yeah, sorry. I was just about to go to a break, but no, I'm not. I'm going to move on. Rosie Duffield, do you know who she is? Labour MP? Well, she's considering her future in the Labour Party after what she calls obsessive harassment from current and former party members. The Canterbury MP claimed that in a series of tweets the following: I'm aware of yet more personal, libelous, nasty and fictional, can I say that next word at tea time? Well, it's on your screen. Crap, she says, being published about me again today. All published and written by ex and current Labour members who are clearly absolutely obsessed by my private life for some reason. I've been subjected to this rubbish for several years now. It is obsessive harassment. Neither the Labour Party or the former or current leader or the Whip's office have done anything at all to stop it, to offer me any support, help or legal assistance. Duffield has received online threats to her safety, This is all following, by the way, her comments on transgender rights and women's sex-based, sex-based rights and all that. You know the conversation anyway. She basically believes that spaces should be protected where those born male are not allowed to go, such as she'll say things like domestic violence, refuges and prisons. This is what she had to say at an LGB conference last year.
But my lived experience is that of 51% of the country, and I know what it's like to be a woman. I don't know what it's like to be trans. Germaine Greer, I think, was cancelled when she said on a programme, I'm not here to talk about trans rights, it's not something I know about. I know about women's lived experience. For me to be called homophobic is the most insulting and distressing thing. I can't shut up and I can't sort of be quiet, but yes, this idea that women's rights are, we have to justify talking about them. It's just completely ridiculous.
There you go. She says she shouldn't shut up. No, she should not. Rick, what's going on?
I mean, most of Rosie's comments were about women's safe spaces, which I feel is a debate that does need to be had and is being kind of brushed over at the moment. I mean, she couldn't even go to her own conference for fear of the backlash, and I haven't heard Labour condemn that. It seems to me that Labour want to kind of approach one group and stick up for them and not another. I mean, even locally in Blackburn, there was a councillor that was hounded out of the council for having her own opinions, and the levels of misogyny in that case were off the scale, and she's still waiting for Labour to investigate. And I just think that with these issues, like I say, with women's rights, trans rights, there's arguments from both sides, but the debate has to happen so we can find the right balance and the right position to take.
Well, I think you've been very polite, Rick. I think personally the world's gone absolutely bonkers.
So do I.
Kerry Dingle.
I think the world has gone mad. I mean, it's extraordinary, isn't it, that someone like Rosie Duffield, who was lauded for winning, I think, her seat in Canterbury as turning it from blue to red, and yet her own party won't stand by her when she says only women have a cervix, and her own leader won't stand by her, and actually Boris won't even take that one on. And she's called someone who supports equality, and I support equality very fervently, is nonetheless called a transphobe if you believe there is a biological reality, and that is only women have a cervix, rather than going with the gender fluidity, it's whatever I feel like today. I have a real problem with that. I think the trans activists who are into all this stuff and vilifying people like Rosie and sending death threats are anti-equality.
Yeah, I do feel, James, and I guess, you know, this is a real concern of mine, that I feel that we're in a society often where basic things that are facts and before just wouldn't even be disputed, they're just facts. Now, it seems that for fear of causing offence to people, we're willing to kind of deny all kinds of simplistic, basic things. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that is a problem with the whole trans debate. So, for example, I don't see why we cannot retain the category of biological woman and trans woman, and it doesn't mean that one is somehow lesser than the other in terms of equality. I do think there is a kind of fraught and complicated debate over things like gender self-ID, for example. So I don't believe, of course, as the MP doesn't, that someone should just simply be able to self-ID as a man should be able to self-ID as a woman and therefore enter women's spaces. However, I do think someone who's born male, who's transitioned to be female, I'm not sure they should necessarily go into a men's prison, because I don't think that would be a safe situation for them either. So I think there is a debate to be had. But as the point was made earlier, in a democratic society, you have to be able to let this debate take place. And if someone, an MP, a member of parliament, is being threatened, harassed and abused on social media, I don't think that's acceptable at all. And I think this idea that because someone is in the public eye, they're therefore fair game for all this stuff, I just think it's complete nonsense.
Yeah, I sound like a stuck record, but I worry that the world is going mad, and it will have consequences, you mark my words. Going to take a quick break. Coming up, have you ever experienced roadside harassment? If so, and it's something that troubles you, things will be looking up, because there's undercover female police officers catching sexist drivers. We'll have that coming up after the break.
Hello there, I'm Eamon.
And I'm Isabel.
And you're watching the GB News digital stream across the United Kingdom.
And around the world.
If you're here in the UK, you can also watch us on your TV screen. GB News is Freeview channel 236.
On Sky, we're channel 515.
626 on Virgin Media.
Just remember, you might need to retune your TV to watch the channel.
Yeah, and if you are doing that, find out more about retuning by going to gbnews.uk.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, and there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilized conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon
and Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
Hello there, welcome back to Dewbs & Co with me, Michelle Dewberry. Just a quick reminder for those listening, not watching, who my panel are. We've got Rick Moore, Deputy Chair of Blackburn Conservative Association, Kerry Dingle, who's a filmmaker, and James Bloodworth, who is an author and journalist. I can tell you, we've just been continuing that debate in the break, and I think this whole kind of self-ID and all that kind of stuff, it's a fascinating conversation. It certainly has strong opinions attached to it. Definitely, I think, a topic that I'm going to cover in a future show. But for now, I want to talk to you about drivers. Now, have you ever been in a street just minding your own business when some guy, and let's face it, more often than not, it is a guy. Come on. I mean, I know some of you will be at home going, women do it too, but on the whole, it's largely men doing this to women. And what am I talking about? I'm talking about catcalling, whistling, whatever you want to call it. The police are now getting involved. There's a new operation set up, and basically catcallers could face a fixed penalty, court sentencing, or a £1,000 fine if caught by plain-clothed officers. This is a crackdown by West Yorkshire Police, and it comes after a rise in complaints of harassment. The complaints that we mention include the use of sexual language or making unwanted approaches towards women. Right, let's get into this then, shall we? What do you think of all this? Is it a bit of an overreaction, or is it a bit of something that's been a long time coming? Are lines being kind of stepped over, blared? James Bloodworth, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's context dependent in some ways, because, like, what are we talking about here? If we're talking about like harassment, so somebody in a car following a woman down a dark street, or any street for that matter, I think that does become a harassment, and shouting lewd comments as well. But at the same time, what does an unwanted approach mean? What does that mean? Someone who's, say, who approaches a man who approaches a woman in a bar or in a coffee shop, is it? How do you know it's wanted until you approach the person? You know, if it's polite, if it's not lewd, like it's just quite vague language, I think, and that's like I have no problem with catcallers being pulled up by the police or people who shout lewd comments at women or harass women, but it needs to be very specific, I think, in the definitions of what this is, because otherwise you're going to... It seems like a slight waste of the police resources otherwise. And you're going to drag in people who, you know, it isn't what most of us would consider harassment, but someone just doesn't like the fact that this person's approached them because then they find them unattractive, for example.
Rick?
Yeah, I agree with James. It is, you've got to be more specific about it, and what they've said is very, very vague. I mean, it's hard for me to sort of relate to the impact of a woman having unwanted approaches.
What, you mean you don't get randomly wolf whistles?
Well, I don't. I was thinking. I was
street?
going to say. I think I'd be quite flattered if that was to happen. But I can understand that it might make people feel uncomfortable. So it really does depend on what we're talking about. But if we are just talking about wolf whistles and a passing, maybe complimentary comment that some wanted, surely there's more priorities. I mean, Batley, for example, is on West Yorkshire Police's patch. They've had a big problem with grooming gangs that came to light, I think, just 2 years ago. I would say that was more important.
Absolutely.
Kerry?
Well, I just think this is ludicrous and ridiculous. This is treating women like Victorian or Edwardian ladies that are in need of protection. And we now need plainclothes police officers, checking whether someone's, shouted a sexy or lewd remark or been a bit laddish, or wolf whistled you. I mean, for some people it is a compliment. When you get to my age, it would be a huge compliment. And at other times, it might be a bit unwanted, but big deal. It used to be that, you were advised you couldn't walk past a building site because someone up a scaffold might wolf whistle or shout, all right, love, or, get your knickers off, or whatever at you. And in truth, they were never going to come off the scaffold and assault you. You deal with it. You say something back, you walk on, and, if George Clooney cat called you, you'd be made up, wouldn't you? Harvey Weinstein, it might be a different story. But I think we should just stop treating women as these pathetic victims that can't stand up for themselves. 200 years of fighting for women's rights, and we've taught blokes this isn't good enough. We don't need undercover cops who should be doing a proper job investigating things like grooming gangs, running around looking after us.
But the flip side to this, because I'm, a little bit of a feisty northerner and I can certainly stand up for myself, but I experienced something probably about a year or so ago now, and I was stood at a zebra crossing. And now that I'm starting this story, I'm thinking it might be a little bit inappropriate for tea time talking, but I'll change my language a bit. I was at a zebra crossing, just minding my own business, waiting to cross the road, and I had my baby in a pram. And I just recently had a caesarean. So some women will know that when you have a C-section, you've got a scar. And scars can be quite itchy. So I was itching, minding my own business in my own little world, probably, just having a little rub of my scar. And a white van, always a white van, came up to the traffic lights, and the guy wound his window down. And I can't tell you at tea time what he told me that he thought I was doing and wished that I was doing. And it stopped me in my tracks. And then the white van got stopped in the traffic because there was traffic. And I was just about to go over to this guy and tell him a thing or two, because actually I just got out of hospital. I was in an enormous amount of pain, and I was just literally rubbing a scar that was really causing me discomfort. And I didn't appreciate this person thinking that he could sexualise that and be making those comments to me. And I was just about to go over and tell him. And then I remembered I had a baby in a pram, and life had changed for me, and I probably should just go on with my business. But it kind of stopped me and made me kind of think, who does he think that he is to be able to make that comment?
Sure, but you were quite prepared, even in pain, to deal with it. And women are quite capable of dealing with it.
Some women, people like me and you are quite feisty individuals, so we would perhaps go over there. But if you're timid, or if you're... Well, I guess the point that I'm trying to say here is, why should you have to accept that?
Well, I think we're in danger of, making more girls timid, in fact, by saying it's got to be a third party that intervenes. And actually, girls recognising how capable they are and standing up for themselves is what's changed laddish culture over many years. Things are 100 times better, than probably even when we were young. And that's because we don't tolerate things. If we constantly need legal protection for everything we do, we're turned into imbeciles.
Yeah, I mean, I do have to say, I don't want anyone to be harassed or abused, but I mean, I started my programme pretty much by talking about the vast scale of child sex exploitation that is going completely ignored in many instances. So I would really prefer the police to actually be focusing, looking inwards what's going on there and dealing with that, as opposed to looking at who's whistling when there perhaps shouldn't be. Lots of you guys, though, I've got to say, you're emailing in about this topic. Lots of divided opinions on the whole. Lots of men writing in, obviously, saying that they don't kind of agree with this whole sentiment and that the police should perhaps have other things to do. But Jackie, for example, she's got in touch. She agrees with you. She says women are not helpless creatures who can't cope with catcalls. The snowflakes who can't deal with it need to get a grip. That's what Jackie says. Karen says, I would have thought that there's enough crime that needs combating without the police spending all this time. Perhaps they should put as much effort into the grooming gangs. Here. Karen, I completely agree with you. Helen says, when I was young, builders used to stop work to whistle at passing women. I doubt any of the men would dare do that any day nowadays. Ginny says, well, I personally love being catcalled. Makes me laugh. Mike says, men who catcall really do let the rest of us men down. Plain-clothed officers, though, should be exactly that. Plain-clothed. There you go. Then he starts talking about pole dancing. Got to say, you lost me on that one, Mike. You lost me towards the end of your comment, but I was with you up until that point. Karen says, unfortunately, in lots of places, hurt feelings are considered to be more important than hurt bodies. And Jenny says, wouldn't the undercover cops be put to better use using the grooming gangs rather than wolf whistling? And by the way, she says, when we're talking about the police, they don't even bother investigating burglaries. I agree with you on that one, I have to say. Right, what am I doing? What time is it? Oh, yes, we've got time, I think, to move on to a different conversation. Let's talk music, shall we? New data shows that young people are choosing to stream older music from their parents' generation than the new trendy stuff. Old records by artists such as Bob Dylan and Bruce Springsteen made up 70% of albums that were sold across America last year, despite huge releases from Adele and Ed Sheeran. And apparently interest in your vinyl classics, that's contributed to the trends as well. And David Bowie was the top-selling artist on that format. It got me thinking. I have to say I am partial to a bit of Roy Orbison myself. Rick, your thoughts? Who's your musical taste?
My tastes kind of vary from genre to genre. I listen to some stuff that me parents listened to, though I have to say it did used to make my ears bleed when they played the Nolans. But my kids will listen to some stuff that we do, then they've got their own tastes that I can't stand. So I just think it's kind of each to their own when it comes to music.
Well, I've got to say, James, what was I listening to the other day? I was watching something or listening to something, and I was thinking to myself how lovely the lyrics were in them olden days. And then I listen to some of the stuff now that, say, for example, my teenage godson would listen to, and it's so crude, and actually, I would say quite disgusting. And I think, what a difference. You're laughing at me. But I do, Kerry. I listen to it today.
I know.
No, I was thinking exactly the same. I was in hospital with my grandmother recently, and we were playing her some old music, and it was, I think, some of her favourites. It was like Perry Como and Bing Crosby in the 20s and 30s era. And I was thinking this exact same thing, is the lyrics were much more meaningful and romantic, whereas a lot of the songs now, it's either cliches, it's either rehashed cliches, or it's just completely sexualised to an extent where it just becomes boring. There's no mystery to it. So I definitely agree with you, and I think a lot of the mainstream content that's churned out now by record companies, it caters to a formula, like the Marvel films and things like that. It caters to this formula, and it doesn't really diverge from that formula, and it tends to get quite boring after a while.
But also, I think young people, like we're talking then about catcalling, and you're going to set the undercover police out on men that shout stuff to women. If you're a young kid growing up, and I've got a little boy, so I'm perhaps more focused on this, but I think to myself, they mustn't know if they're coming or going, because they put the music on, and it's all this sexual stuff, which I'll keep your sweet ears from hearing, because it is tea time, but it's all this really sexual stuff. So that's what you're being bombarded with. You're kind of growing up with that, watching that, listening to that, and then you're being told, don't say anything rude to a lady, or else you might find yourself in prison. It's a bit confusing, isn't it, Kerry?
I think, well, I can imagine there's a lot of young lads, especially teenagers, not knowing which way to turn in terms of, what you can and can't do. In fact, a friend of mine was saying that she was asking me what to say to her son, who was saying, I've asked a girl out, she said no, so is it abusive if I ask her out a second time. I mean, they really... I'm not sure...
Well, God loves a trier. What advice did you give?
Which way I said, keep trying. Which way to go? I mean, I love all sorts of music, but the reason I was laughing at you, Michelle, is because what we like is... music you like is pretty generationally defining. You know, most of us, maybe especially me, I don't know what it is youngsters are listening to. I hear it and I think, oh, my God, white noise. You know, it's got no decent lyrics, it's tuneless, it's not melodic, it's terrible. Whereas, you know, give me a bit of Elvis or Andre Bocelli or, you know, something a bit more interesting, and I'll love it. And I always want to hit the dance floor. But that's because as we get older, we don't keep up with the times and the tunes, and we are never going to like what our kids or grandkids like, but it's great to know that they've got a bit of time for the oldies.
I mean, I remember when I was younger and brought Guns N' Roses' Use Your Illusion albums home, and my mum and dad had a fit because there was the odd swear word on there. But, you know, I mean, times change, and the older the music that you go back, I think I agree that, you know, the lyrics, the meaning to the songs, there's a lot more there than there is, and quite often I'll hear a cover version of something and then go out to find out who did it originally and listen to the original version and find that I prefer that.
Well, there you go. You guys are talking. Nigel said that Kerry Dingle should be Prime Minister. She's got common sense in Dewbs, says Nigel. Pauline says, dear Michelle, if I got wolf whistled in the street, I'd say, firstly, thank you very much, followed by, maybe you should have gone to Specsavers. David says, why only women? That's sexist, Michelle. There you go, says David. Anyway, that is all we've got time for. Thank you very much. I've enjoyed tonight. I've enjoyed your company. James, Kerry and Rick, thank you. And thank you at home for your thoughts as well. Do keep your thoughts coming in. If there's ever a topic that you think, why isn't anyone talking about it? Get in touch with me. Tell me, what is it that you want us to talk about? I'm always fascinated, by the way, about Partygate. Of course, I'll always cover that topic if there's a development in the story, but I don't think I can bear this incessant daily focus on it. But would you prefer that I did? Is that what you want to hear about every day? Tell me, gbviews@gbnews.uk. Have yourself a good evening. I'll be back tomorrow 6 till 7. And up next, it's Nigel Farage.
Hello again. Following some brighter skies at times on Tuesday, a lot more cloud will feed in from the west during the next 24 hours, and that cloud will contain some rain in the north, and it will contain mild air. That mild air coming in from the west and southwest around the edge of this high pressure. Low pressure moving away, so the isobars starting to move further apart in the north. That means it's going to become less windy for the far north of Scotland, but still a blustery night, still some showers for the Northern Isles and sleet and snow possible for Shetland. Otherwise, thicker cloud arriving from the west. Outbreaks of rain and drizzle for northern England, southern and western Scotland, Northern Ireland for a time. And with the cloud and the breeze coming from a mild direction, it's going to be a frost-free night.